We come back to Hegel, and I'd like today to round out our discussion of Hegel and perhaps move to some of the things which immediately followed because of the way he was construed. But conversation just now before class leads me to point to two different interpretations of Hegel, which I think have a bearing on how easy it is to understand him. There was, for a number of years, I think, in the English-speaking world, an interpretation of Hegel which tried to see him virtually as an 18th century Enlightenment rationalist, trying to work out deductively a speculative metaphysics. In other words, trying to do in his way what people like Descartes or Leibniz tried to do in their way. That is to say, he was a speculative metaphysician. However, with the growing influence in the 20th century of phenomenology in Europe, an alternative interpretation has developed, which I think is much more in keeping with Hegel himself, from whom phenomenology developed, and which interpretation I've been trying to suggest to you as we've been going along. Namely, that we have to take seriously the title of his major work, The Phenomenology of Mind. So that he's not trying to prove something or develop a well-argued rationalistic system. When he says that the real is rational and the rational is real, he's not using that as a lever for another speculative metaphysic. But rather taking seriously the sense of phenomenology as that has become understood in the 20th century, he's trying to describe, you see, the phenomenon, the consciousness of being. At the individual consciousness level, that is my consciousness of being. At perhaps the societal level, a nation's consciousness of its being. And in the case of the absolute, the all-inclusive, the absolute's consciousness of its being. Now, I think it's that latter phrase which may be difficult. Your own consciousness of being, that's not so difficult. And of course, that's where the emphasis in 20th century phenomenology have been. That's what Jean-Paul Sartre is about, the existentialists. But what Hegel is after is describing the universal phenomenon of the self's own self-consciousness, consciousness of being, as that unfolds. As, for instance, in something like the master-servant relationship, in interpersonal relationships. And in that meandering through the situation of the Stoic, the skeptic, the unhappy consciousness, and so forth. Movements of reflection like that in one's own conscious being. And in talking of objective spirit, he's talking of the way in which national self-consciousness arises in the light of the concept of law and constitutional government. National identity begins to emerge, you see. Well, and when he gets to absolute spirit, the section for today, then you get to the third phrase, you see, the absolute consciousness of being. Now, the closest you can get to that in theological language of Judaism or Christianity would be to talk of God's own knowledge. And from Augustine and Thomas Aquinas onwards, theologians have indeed talked of the knowledge of God, not just in our sense of our knowing God, but in God's sense of God's knowing, and God's knowing himself, God's self-knowledge. Now, inasmuch as Hegel is process metaphysician, you see, he's thinking of God's self-knowledge, not of God as evolving, but of God's self-knowledge as being objectified in the world he's creating, you see, in the course of the unfolding history of the universe. And he sees God's self-knowledge as unfolding in our self-knowledge, first of all, subjective spirit, you see. And in a moment, when we'll get to talking about his religion and his theology, we'll find him saying that our self-consciousness is really God's self-consciousness. God is conscious of himself through our self-consciousness. You see? Because if God is the all-inclusive being, then my consciousness is a finite moment of God's consciousness. And my self-consciousness is a finite moment of God's self-consciousness. So God's own knowledge of himself is a knowledge of himself in and through our knowledge of ourselves, our self-consciousness, our conscious being. But then God's self-consciousness is objectified in, shall we say, his thinking of the world of nature, which he has created, you see. And certainly in the medieval tradition, if all of nature in some way was imaging the manifold perfection of the deity, if we contemplating nature are drawn to contemplate the perfection of God, then certainly God, in contemplating his handiwork, is contemplating himself. You see. But the fullest expression, development, manifestation of God's self-knowledge, knowledge of his being, is when the form of thought, logic, synthesized with the stuff of nature, you see, by virtue of the imaginative creativity of subjective spirit, as one part of the consciousness of being of a national spirit. Hence you get him talking of the art of different cultures and the religion of different cultures and the philosophy of different nations, you see. When the subjectivity, the creativity, imagination of the individual spirit, okay, in the context of that national consciousness of its being, produces art, religion, philosophy. These creative expressions are not only creative expressions of the human spirit, since the human spirit is moment of the divine, creative expression of the divine spirit, you see. So there's some phenomenology describing the consciousness of being, you see, a phenomenology of the consciousness of being, gets to describing that as it comes out most fully of all in these manifestations of absolute spirit. Yeah, if God's self-consciousness is in and through our self-consciousness, and God's creativity is exercised in and through our creativity, then the divine consciousness of its own being is in the world of art, another creative expression of the human spirit. Okay. Now, I think if you read Hegel with that sort of thing in mind, he's doing a phenomenological description, describing the phenomena. Doing a phenomenological description of the growing consciousness of being. Okay. Don't look for him to prove things in the old fashion. Don't look at this as a speculative system with no grounding in observation. It's introspective observation or historical observation, all the way along. And inasmuch as history is the activity of the divine spirit, his discussion of art, religion, and philosophy is historical. You see? Because it's in the history of these creative expressions that the movement of the absolute becomes most evident. Okay, does that come through clearly? It does to me, but I'm wondering, does it to you? Okay. I've said every other day we've been talking about Hegel, but sometimes saying it in different ways helps. Cale?
Does God have any self-consciousness aside of us? Apart from us?
Does God have self-consciousness apart from us? I don't know what Hegel would say there, because his emphasis in the phenomenology is so much in terms of his self-consciousness in and through us. And this may depend on how you read his theology. He purports, you see, he thinks of himself as a Lutheran Christian. He explicitly, however, rejects ex nihilo creation. And that part is important. You see, that's what makes him a panentheist. Everything is in God. But if he's a panentheist and not a pantheist, you might well be asking Cale, well, if everything is in God, but God is more than everything, does he have any leftover self-consciousness that's not our self-consciousness, individually or collectively? You see? Or does the creation, as it were, exhaust the consciousness of the divine being? Well, it certainly seems to me he ought to say the latter. Yet I don't think he does. And it may be that his response to the leftover question would be, well, history isn't finished yet. So at any stage in history, there is still more self-consciousness that God is going to have. Now, that's an odd way to put it. God is going to have more self-consciousness. You see. But the point is that if consciousness is a process, if he agrees with Kant that time is the form of consciousness, you see, then